Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's 5 o'clock here on the East Coast of North Carolina, but maybe you can pretend that it's 5 o'clock wherever you are. Come on, you know I had to make that corny joke. I'm joining you live from the coast of North Carolina. I'm Wiley Cash. I'm a novelist living and working and writing here in the very muggy and very buggy Cape Fear region of North Carolina. And I am really excited today to have an accomplished taster and writer and critic with us, and I will get to her in just a moment. But first, I want to welcome you on behalf of SIBA. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. They represent over 650 independent bookstores throughout the southern United States. And perhaps today you were invited specifically by one of those bookstores. So if you're interested in what Susan is talking about today, our author, we encourage you to please, as we say, dance with the one that brung you and purchase her books from the bookstore that invited you. And if you're here and you just kind of found your way to us, please look into SIBA and look into how you can support your independent bookstore community. But I want to introduce our guest today. Let me get out of this view. Our guest is Susan Reigler. She is a former restaurant critic for the Louisville Courier-Journal, and she's a current correspondent for Bourbon and American Whiskey magazines. She has also co-authored or authored 7 books on bourbon, including Kentucky Bourbon Country, The Essential Travel Guide, and the Kentucky Bourbon Cocktail Book. So if you are like me, you should probably enjoy this event with a pen and a pad or a pencil to take notes, or perhaps you're enjoying it with a selection of bourbons. But however you enjoy it, I'm sure at the end of this, you're going to have questions. At the bottom of your screen here on Zoom is a little chat bubble. If you want to ask Susan a question, we encourage you to go to that chat bubble and ask your question there. Make sure to mention your name and the name of your home bookstore so we can give them a proper shout out. And I will deliver your question to Susan. But for now, I invite you to sit back, sip away, enjoy her talk and her tasting. She may be having all the fun in this one, much more fun than authors normally get to have. But I will turn it over to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Wiley. Well, I'm a bourbon author, so I have a lot of fun as an author almost all the time, which is kind of hard not to. And I hope some of you brought some bourbon with you today for this event, because what I'm actually going to be doing, it was originally going to be both Peggy Snow Stevens and I doing this, since we wrote the book together, Which Fork Do I Use with My Bourbon? But Peggy is doing another virtual event right now. Since we rescheduled this one, she's off doing another one. So that's the advantage of having 2 authors for one book. We can be in 2 places at once, which is very, very helpful. So Peggy is she was the first woman master taster for a bourbon distiller ever. And she now has a private consulting company, but she was the founder of the Bourbon Women Association, which I serve on the board, and I'm a past president of that organization. I see that there are a lot of women present today. bourbonwomen.org if you happen to be interested in finding more like-minded bourbon drinkers. And we also allow members who have Y chromosomes. So if you know a boyfriend or significant other who would be interested, brother, father, tell them about it too. So I think first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about what bourbon is. Of course, it's a type of whiskey, and it's a whiskey. Any whiskey is going to be a spirit that is distilled from fermented grain. And the grain is pretty much what defines the type of whiskey. So bourbon is primarily made from corn. It's a corn-based whiskey. It has to be at least 51% corn. The vast majority of them are well over 70% corn. Then the other ingredients are usually rye, sometimes wheat, and malted barley. So the difference between that and, say, Scotch is just about, well, it's almost always 100% barley. Rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye. So those are sort of the parameters, kind of how to go about tasting. What to expect to taste. And bourbon is sweeter than other kinds of whiskeys, because think about how cornbread is going to be sweeter than rye bread or sweeter than whole wheat bread. Cornbread is simply, corn just has a very high amount of sugar in it. So there's a lot of sugar available for fermentation. So that's kind of a very thumbnail sketch of what bourbon is. It also has to be made in the United States. In 1964, Congress defined bourbon as a exclusively American product. And so you can't outsource the bourbon industry. Now, 95% of it's made in Kentucky, and I'm talking to you from Kentucky, from Louisville, as a matter of fact, where 1/3 of the world's bourbon is made. We'll talk about that in a second. But it does have to be at least 51% corn, and it has to be aged in new charred oak containers, which are almost always 53-gallon barrels, and aged to be called straight bourbon, aged for a minimum of 2 years. But the minute the new make whiskey off the still goes into a barrel, it's bourbon, as soon as it touches the wood. But in order to get some flavor, a lot more flavor, and all the color, it needs to age for a while, because all of your color and about 70% of the flavor of bourbon whiskey comes from the barrel. So those are kind of the quick parameters of bourbon. So I'm going to taste what is really kind of thought of as Louisville's hometown bourbon. It's made here. It has been made here since 1870. And it's called Old Forester. And it's an interesting brand for so many reasons. It is a historic brand. As I said, it's been around since 1870. It is the only bourbon on the market today that is made by the same distillery, that's the Brown-Forman Corporation, the same distillery that made it before Prohibition. There are a lot of old brands still around, but they've almost all been sold. They've all been sold to other distillers. Some distilleries went out of business. Some have revived brands. They swap around a lot, but Old Forester is the same one in the same company for all that time. The company was founded by George Garvin Brown. He was a pharmaceutical salesman, which meant he sold whiskey. So whiskey was medicine, just as a lot of us still think of it that way, I suppose. But he had an idea that was pretty revolutionary at the time. He was selling whiskey to store owners, general store owners, and to physicians. And, between the distillery and its destination, there was a lot of opportunity for some hanky-panky to happen, because the bourbon was sold in barrels. And if you went to the store to get whiskey, you would take your own container. The store owner would top up your container from his barrel, and maybe that barrel is getting low and the store is not going to get another shipment for, say, 2 or 3 weeks, but there's still going to be thirsty customers. So what's that shopkeeper going to do? He's probably going to add some water to his whiskey to top up the barrel. But then that's going to lower the proof. You're not going to get as much bang for your buck out of that. So what's the solution to that? Add some kerosene. That'll up the proof, okay? And it's also sort of diluted, so the color's a little off. So you might want to add some tea or some prune juice, or my personal favorite, the leavings in the spittoon that's down by the counter at the store. So these are all ways that bourbon and whiskey supplies are kind of tampered with. And again, if it was going from a distillery to a doctor's office, again, there was opportunity for a wagon driver or his pals to open that barrel and take some whiskey and maybe do some of the same things of altering it so the customer couldn't find out it had been tampered with, except of course they would, because the whiskey quality was a little weird. So Brown was getting complaints from his customers about the quality of the whiskey, and he said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to sell my bourbon exclusively in sealed glass bottles. Now, glass bottles in 1870 were not inexpensive to make. The mass manufacturing of glass bottles had not yet happened. But George Garvin Brown gambled that his customers would pay for quality. If they were going to get a consistent product, that they would pay a little more to get quality whiskey. And today, the fifth generation of his family are the majority stockholders in the Brown-Forman Corporation. That this obviously was a gamble that paid off pretty nicely. And one of his great-great-great-grandsons is the CEO of the Old Forester brand. And by the way, I mentioned that whiskey was medicine. Old Forester has nothing to do with lumberjacks. Brown went to his friend, Dr. William Forester, and said, may I use your name for my bourbon? Because if people know it has a doctor's name on it, then it's bound to be good, right? So that's where the name Old Forester came from, which I just think it's a great history. It's and a lovely bourbon. You'll find it's the well bourbon in a lot of bars in Louisville. And Louisville, of course, has its own official cocktail, which is the Old Fashioned. And I must say, I'm very happy to live in a city that has an official cocktail. I think there are not very many places around the country that can say that. You know, New York has the Manhattan, and New Orleans has the Sazerac, and Louisville has the Old Fashioned. So there we are. So let's talk a little bit about the Old Forester. So I'm going to taste it. This is a whiskey tasting glass. It's called a Glencairn glass. It was developed in Scotland. And the shape, basically it's, it's a bubble at the bottom, bulges out, sort of tulip shaped, and sort of the chimney will kind of trap some of the aromas of the whiskey in it. So what you want to do when you're tasting whiskey, first of all, you're going to evaluate the color. And that's why I have a couple of fingers in here, because that allows me to really get a good idea of the color on it. And you can see it's a really nice deep amber color, kind of coppery. Means it's got some age on it. And in fact, Old Forester, there's no age statement on the label, but Brown-Forman will tell you that they batch their whiskeys for their bottlings. And usually they're between 5 and 7 year old barrels. They kind of pick out the ones they think are going to make a consistent product for them. So after you take a look at the color and you see that it's a nice, clear, sparkly color, no haziness, then you're going to nose it. This is not like nosing wine, okay? Remember, this is not a super high proof bourbon. This is 86 proof, and bourbon has to be bottled at a minimum of 80 proof, and it can go up to, in the 120s and more, which is a little bit like breathing fire. But 86 is a real nice, it has a little oomph to it, but it's not overwhelming. Still, 86 proof means that's 43% alcohol, as opposed to your 5% alcohol in beer or 14% alcohol in wine. So you want to approach it with some respect. So what you want to do in nosing a bourbon, first you'll have your mouth slightly open, nose it, blow away the alcohol, because you'll initially get an alcohol hit as you nose it. Then nose it again. And now you start to get all of the aromatics that are going to come off of this glass in this particular whiskey. This will work with any whiskey. It's just sort of, there are other ways of doing it. Other people have different ways of going about it. That happens to be my technique, and it's one that actually Freddie Johnson, who's a Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame tour guide at Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfurt, he instructs people to use that, and I found it to be very, very successful. So after you nose it, what are you going to look for? Well, the characteristics of bourbon whiskey is going to be a strong caramel and or vanilla flavor. Sometimes it's more caramel, sometimes it's more vanilla, sometimes it's a nice balance. In general, Old Forester, most people think, and again, everybody's sense of smell, sense of taste is different, but majority of people find a lot of caramel in Old Forester. And of course, in which fork do I use with my bourbon? Peggy and I talk a lot about food pairings, and you can think about it, it shouldn't be surprising, because virtually all the descriptors we use for describing whiskey are food terms. So caramel, vanilla, just sort of think what's in your pantry, and you will certainly be able to recognize, using your taste memory, what you're detecting. You also want to look for any kind of fruit flavors, any sorts of fruity aromas. And these can be, oh, all sorts of things: apple and pear and orange and citrus and lemon peel and cherry, dark fruits like figs. It just depends on the bourbon. And a lot of times those fruit aromas come from the fermentation process, because the yeast, in addition to producing alcohol and giving off carbon dioxide, also produce a whole class of aromatic compounds called esters. And an esters make what make bananas smell like bananas, make flowers smell like flowers. You know, a rose has a particular rose scented ester in it. And so those esters, depending upon the strain of yeast used by a distillery, those fruity notes will be very characteristic of individual whiskeys. So in this one, there is some apple, but Old Forester, a lot of people will always find in it, it has a strong component of banana. So far we have caramel and banana, which sounds like a pretty nice combination. And then you also want to think about what sorts of maybe spices you would detect in this, or some nuttiness, and some baking spices. Sometimes it's more herbal. Sometimes you can get something like dill, but Old Forester generally has sort of that baking spice component, kind of like cinnamon. So that's a little bit of what I'm picking up on the nose. And you might also get just a little touch of oak from that time in the barrel. So let's give it a taste. Let it roll around in your tongue. Let it sort of go all the way back to the back of your throat. You sort of call that the Kentucky chew, you know, when you sort of let it roll around in there. Yeah, it's just sort of the Kentucky chew. And then the finish, it's going to be warm. It's going to be very nice and warm, and it kind of settles down your throat. You get kind of that nice dry finish. You know, it's very clean, and it's real warming, sort of right in the center of your chest, which we like to call the Kentucky hug. So even in this time of having to distance, if you feel you need a hug, maybe a little bourbon will substitute for you on that. So again, I'm still picking up a ton of caramel, getting those spices, getting the fruit note, probably some apple, ripe apple along with the banana. And here's a way you can dissect and bring out those different layers of flavor in your bourbon. So take a piece of dried fruit. I have a little dried cherry here, and sort of let that coat your tongue in your mouth. And now try the bourbon again. That really sweetens it up. That fruit pops out. You're like going now from having that banana apple to just having almost fruit salad. Really sweetens it up. Very, very fruity. Now, other components. Let's talk about bringing out some of the drier elements. To have a pecan. Okay, now after a pecan, try it again. The fruit is gone, and now you taste the oak. You taste that this was a product that aged in, you know, oak barrel for several years. And so it completely dries out the fruit. You don't even get the fruit flavor, but you're getting all those lovely wood tannins. They're very smooth wood tannins. They're not bitter, but you're definitely getting those wood tannins. Now you want to put your bourbon back together again. So a little piece of caramel candy. Very chewy caramel candy. Mm. And now the bourbon is whole again. You've taken out each of those flavor components, put them back together again. So that's kind of a very basic bourbon tasting. You can do this comparing different styles of bourbon, different brands of bourbon. It's just a lot of caramel. And that's just really the way to start and approach a bourbon. So I'm very happy to take questions from anybody who might have some.
Yeah, we've got some questions coming in, and I want to remind people that was really, really interesting. First of all,
Well, thank you.
cycling through the different nibbles on things, the cherry, the pecan, that's just so fascinating to me. I want to remind folks when you're asking questions, make sure you include your name and your hometown bookstore that you want to give a shout out to. But I want to be selfish, and I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you to begin with, if that's okay.
Sure.
What is your background? Like, what prepared you to be a bourbon besides desire? But what got you interested in tasting bourbon and sharing it with people and talking about it and really analyzing it?
It did not hurt to be born in Louisville, Kentucky. Okay, that was the first start. When I was a child, my father's hobby was going to the horse races, and virtually every Saturday in the spring and fall of my childhood was spent at Churchill Downs. When you walked into the racetrack, it smelled like old wood and popcorn and hot dogs and cigars and bourbon, which was a pretty heady mix, I must say. Now, when I was little, I wasn't quite sure what that bourbon smell was, but I figured that out later on. But it was very characteristic. It was literally bourbon was in the air as I was growing up. But when I became the restaurant critic at the Louisville Courier-Journal, this was, I guess I started in 1992, and this was when bourbon was just beginning to make a comeback. It had really faded from the Kentucky and the American drinking scene because people had rejected it in the 1960s and early 70s, and vodka was ascendant and wine coolers and all sorts of other travesties of the bar. And in the 90s, people started to notice bourbon again, specifically because the distilleries decided they needed to start marketing themselves more aggressively. And they saw the success of single malt Scotch, of the Scotch industry marketing that as premium libation. And so that's when you started getting people like Maker's Mark, which had an ad campaign that says, tastes expensive and is, positioning themselves as sort of a premium product. And then Maker's was also a pioneer in that it was the first distillery, which is absolutely beautiful. It's this beautiful historic setting south of Bardstown. It was the first distillery to be open to visitors, and people could go and tour the distillery and see where it was made. So when I was writing for the Courier, I was not only reviewing restaurants, but I also was writing about bourbon and doing different stories about the bourbon industry. And also had a column called The Drink, The Sipping News, and I would go around finding various cocktails and other beverages throughout the city, and started writing about bourbon cocktails. Actually met a fabulous bartender who was later inducted into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, with whom I co-authored the Kentucky Bourbon Cocktail book and more Kentucky Bourbon cocktails from her award-winning recipes and some others. So, while other people were definitely doing old fashions and Manhattans, Joy Perini was just being very, very creative with bourbon and coming up with all sorts of new recipes. So that was really when I spent a lot of time writing about bourbon at the Courier-Journal, and then writing about it in other contexts. And when I left the Courier, that's when I did the books with Joy, and I've just been writing about bourbon ever since.
Well,
and the bourbon tourism, of course, when that boomed, that's when I wrote my first edition of the travel guide, and my Kentucky Bourbon Country travel guide will come out in its third edition this fall, this October.
Well, speaking of writing about bourbon and whiskey, you mentioned, the 80s were vodka and wine coolers and things like that. It seems like drinks that you could drink a little faster, a little bit lighter, that you could pair with juices and spritzers and were a little sweeter. Do you think, and I still have another question, I'm being very selfish because you have more questions stacking up, but do you think that is indicative of like the 80s itself being, the me generation and power suits and people on the go and people making the scene, whereas the 90s were perhaps more resonant and more, sedentary is the wrong word, but more staid, more reflective, less showy? Or am I reaching?
I think you're reaching a little bit.
All right.
I think it's called big bourbon distillers doing some blitz marketing is what it was.
Well, there goes my graduate thesis in bourbon.
Sorry, Wiley. Yeah.
Crass. I thought I was going to go straight to the line, the head of the line. But I do want to ask one more question. What do you think it is about bourbon and whiskey that plays such a powerful role in the American imagination? You know, we see plays, we see film, we see literature relying on that shot of whiskey and burning the fire and somebody being drunk on whiskey or tossing back whiskey. Do you think it's just so distinctly American that we identify so much with it?
Well, I think the Scots would have a little something to say about that, since they make a fair amount of whiskey. But really, the history of whiskey on this side of the Atlantic is the history of America in many, many regards. I mean, the American Revolution, before the American Revolution, most of the colonists drank rum. There were more than 60 rum distilleries in Massachusetts alone. And of course, rum is made from fermented sugarcane. And where did sugarcane come from? It came from the Caribbean. And when the United States rebelled, what was going to be the United States rebelled against Britain, the British controlled the sugarcane industry. So there went the rum distillers in the colonies. And what we did have was a lot of grain. And in New York and Pennsylvania and Northern Virginia and Maryland, people were growing rye. So rye whiskey was the first American whiskey. And then at the end of the Revolution, when people started settling in Kentucky, started coming down the Ohio River Valley, Ohio River Valley, sorry, I have a 12-week-old kitten who wants to kind of get in on the action here. Anyway, when people started coming down the Ohio River and settling in what is now Kentucky and southern Indiana and southern Ohio, the grain that really grew like mad here was corn. And so these are farmers who came with their stills, because you used your still to turn grain into whiskey, which was preserved that way. If you had extra grain, it wouldn't rot in the fields. You could use it for bartering. Basically, whiskey was money. And so in the Ohio Valley, these farmer distillers started making whiskey from corn. And some of it was exported down the river as far as New Orleans, where it sat in barrels and aged, and it turned red. And that red whiskey from Kentucky became known as bourbon. Maybe because it was drunk on Bourbon Street. These were a lot of French loyalists, exiles in New Orleans, who couldn't get their cognac because of the French Revolution. And maybe it was, Bourbon Street, or maybe because the port was in Bourbon County, Kentucky. Nobody knows where the name bourbon came from, but that's part of the history of it. And then after the Civil War, bourbon distilling became much, much more commercialized. The farm distillery sort of faded away, and the industry was sort of consolidated into the big commercial distillers.
I love that the American Revolution and the French Revolution are indirectly responsible for rye whiskey and bourbon. That's absolutely fascinating.
Oh yeah, and
absolutely.
Every time the United States needed money, it would tax whiskey. So in fact, at Prohibition, guess when our individual income tax came in? Around Prohibition, because there wasn't any more supply of new whiskey for the government to get money from. So they started taxing us instead of the whiskey stocks. So thank you very much, Prohibition. And hello, Cat. And the Women's Christian Temperance League, don't drink my bourbon.
Well, we do have a couple of questions for an old fashioned.
Ooh, okay. Well, either use a sugar cube or an ounce of simple syrup. Then you add some bitters, probably about 4 dashes of bitters. And a big mistake that's often done in old fashions and in Manhattans is too much of the bitters. So 4 dashes is probably at the top. You add a couple of ounces of bourbon. You're going to mix that, add some ice, and then slice of orange, maybe a cherry. You wouldn't necessarily have to muddle the fruit with the sugar. Some people do, some people don't. It's kind of a matter of personal preference. So a lot of controversy about to muddle or not to muddle, it is to sort of smash the fruit in the drink. But basically it's nice. And I can even do without the cherry, but I like to have the orange or the orange peel in it. But it's pretty simple cocktail. You can add a little water to it, or just add more bourbon. It's fine, you know, whichever. You've got the ice in there too. But it's basically sugar, bourbon, bitters, little fruit, and you're done. Simple.
Well, speaking of being done, thank you so much, Susan. This was fascinating and educational and informational, and I will feel so much less guilty about drinking now than I otherwise do,
so
because
glad.
I will think about the French Revolution and the American Revolution and all
Taxes,
these
the tax base and
the revenuers and tax base and personal tax and all this stuff. I want to thank you all so much for joining us, and especially you, Susan. There are so many wonderful independent bookstores in Kentucky and so many wonderful writers. We had Silas House on here last week. I mean, you all just have so many wonderful things going on in Kentucky.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us. And I want to invite all of you to find a way to join us Thursday. We have another online event at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It's All the Songs We Sing, celebrating 25 years of the Carolina African American Writers Collection, edited by Leonard Moore and the contributors. We're going to have them reading. We'll have North Carolina poet laureate Jackie Shelton Green on here to read some fiction, read some prose, read some poetry, and talk to us about this historical moment we find ourselves in. So thank you all for tuning in. These have been so fun. I really enjoy seeing everybody. I see so many people returning every week. So if your local independent bookstore is not inviting you to these, make sure they know about it. Make sure to get a hold of them and tell them what wonderful things SIBA has going on. We're doing our best to bring authors and their books to you during these times. So have a drink, get a book, dance with the one that brought you, and we'll see you next time.